Masechet Baba Batra, Daf Kof Ayin Vav 176, the very last and the longest Masechet in terms of dapim. It's not actually the longest in terms of words, but it has been quite a journey since the beginning of Baba Batra, and certainly since the beginning of all the Bavot, really all the Bavot, all three form one Masechet, originally called Masechet Nizikin. So this has been over 400 dapim, well over a year that we've been learning about the laws of Nizikin. And we saw the Mishnah says if one wants to be wise, then one should learn these laws. So hopefully we are a little bit wiser after this journey. So we begin. Hosi alav ketav yado shu chayav lo goveh min nechasim bnei horin. We mentioned the distinction before between an oral and a written loan. If someone makes a written loan, then the lender can collect from any property that the borrower owned at the time of the loan. Even if he sold it, the document creates a lien on that. However, if there's no document, even if it's with witnesses, an oral loan, the lender can only collect from land and property that the borrower has currently in his hand when he comes to pay the loan, but not any land that he had sold. It does not create a lien on any property. And the main reason for the distinction is because of kol, of having publicity. It's not fair to go and repossess something if the buyer had no way of finding out. You need title insurance. He has to be able to find out if there is. So if it's in writing, then there's witnesses that sign to that document, and then already that's enough publicity that the buyer can find out, and buyer beware. Whereas if it's oral, then how's anybody supposed to know? No one's ever going to want to buy land, because who knows how many liens there are on it, and it will get repossessed at any moment. And that was the distinction. Now the Mishnah talks about a slightly different case. It's kind of in between. There is a written document, but the document is not signed by witnesses. Rather, it's written in the handwriting of the borrower. And so we can see, right, this is the handwriting of the borrower. He says, I owe you $1,000. So even though it's in writing, nevertheless, the lender cannot collect from liened property because it's the witnesses that are the key factor in making it public, not just the fact that it's in writing. Now we ask a follow-up question. What if you have this IOU that has no witnesses, but it's in the handwriting of the borrower, and the lender brings it and he says, hey, look, you signed this IOU, and the borrower says, well, first ratify it in front of a bet din. And so just like the bet din will ratify signatures of witnesses, so too they come and they ratify that, yes, this IOU was in fact written by the borrower. That is his handwriting, and therefore, yes, you can use it in court to collect. This is proof that this money is owed. Now, once you have the judges involved, and the judges are all signing on it that says, yes, this is the handwriting, this document is ratified, what about in that case? Maybe that would be sufficient publicity that now it's similar to a loan document with witnesses, and the lender could possibly collect from liened property. Would you say that? And Rabbi Yochanan responded, no, even though the document is ratified in front of a bet din, nevertheless, the lender cannot use that to collect from liened property. We'll see why in a moment. But first we're going to challenge this from a Mishnah. Mativ Rami bar Chama. שלושה גיטין פסולין, ואם נישאת הוולד כשר ואלו הן כתב בכתב ידו ואין עליו עדים. יש עליו עדים ואין בו זמן. יש בו זמן ואין בו אלא עד אחד. הרי אלו שלושה גיטין פסולין, ואם נישאת הוולד כשר. This is the first half of the Mishnah. The question is actually going to be from the next part of the Mishnah, but let's first explain this part. There are three types of gitin that are invalid lechatechila. However, b'di'avad, if someone did get divorced with that document, and then that woman went and had a child from another man, that child would not be a mamzer. So in other words, this get on a deoraita level is a valid get, and that's why if she does go ahead and get remarried on the basis of that get, there will not be any deoraita consequences. That child will not be a mamzer. However, it goes against the Rabbanan. The rabbis had certain stipulations, requirements for a get, and so therefore it cannot be used lechatechila. And here are the three types. If a husband, he wrote the get in his own handwriting, but there's no witnesses, so it's clear that he wants it. Any get has to be done by the will, and part of what the witnesses are signing on to is that the husband told us to write this get. This was written with his will. Now, since he's writing it in his own handwriting, so then it's based on his will, and it's given over in front of witnesses. And so one should not do this lechatechila, but b'diavad, it's okay. Or let's say there are witnesses, but there's no date. You're supposed to put a date. If you don't put a date, it's still valid b'diavad. Or let's say it has a date, but there's only one witness. Well, one witness is not enough, but let's say the scribe himself, the scribe, by writing it, he can act like another witness, because if the scribe is writing it, then he wouldn't write it if the husband didn't ask him to. So the scribe and then the one witness can join together to make it a valid get. So in all these three cases, the get is pasul lechatechila, but if you used it and she has another child with someone else, then that child is not a mamzer but is kosher. That's all Tanakama. Rabbi Elazar Omer, af al pi she'en alav edim, ela noteno la b'fnei edim kasher v'gober m'nechasim meshu'badim. Rabbi Elazar says even if there are no witnesses that are signed on the document, as long as it's given from the husband to the wife in front of witnesses, that's valid, because Rabbi Elazar says it's the witnesses to the transfer that make the divorce actually happen, and therefore this is valid. And not only are they considered divorced, but furthermore, the ex-wife now, can collect her ketubah from liened property. The get serves as two functions. It serves, number one, that she can prove that she was divorced, so that when she goes again gets remarried, says, look, I was divorced. But it could also function as a means of collecting the ketubah. She comes to court, she says, I want my ketubah. They said, well, you divorced? Says, yes, well, prove it. Look, I have the get. So the get says, you have to pay me the ketubah amount. And so she could bring that in, and she can use it to collect from liened property, even though there are no signatures that are written in the get, but rather only signatures that saw the husband give it to the wife. And so now we're comparing these two cases, just like a get that has no witnesses on it, but there are witnesses that saw it, and so the witnesses saw that this is the husband's will, and now you can use that get, kind of like a loan document, because you're using the get in order to collect money, and you can collect from lien property. Then so too an IOU that was written just by the borrower, but now it's ratified in front of judges. So those judges that are ratifying it, they could cause publicity, and they are equivalent to the witnesses that see it, even though they're not signed on it. And therefore, just like a wife can collect from lien property her ketubah based on that, so too the lender should be able to collect from liened property once the judges sign on and ratify the handwriting in the IOU. So that's the challenge against Rabbi Yochanan. And we answer, Shaneh hatam demishat ketibah hu deshabed nafsheh. The case of the husband is different because it's from the time of the writing of the get that he submits himself and obligates all of his property that will have a lien on it. In fact, his obligation to pay the ketubah goes back to the time that he signed the ketubah, and so he had in mind he's going to have everything liened on because of that. And so too, when he writes the get, in this case, right? Let's say he wrote the get himself, or he had the scribe writing it. Right, he had in mind that now the ketubah will have to be paid, and all of his property, that's built into the stipulations of the ketubah, that all of his property is liened to pay the ketubah. That's completely different from the IOU, where when the borrower wrote the IOU, whatever, let's say last year, when the loan happened. So there was nobody else there. It's just the borrower and the lender. There are no witnesses. There's no judges or anything. And so he gives the IOU, not having in mind that there would be a lien. Right? There's not that he didn't think that there was going to be a lien on the property. So now you can't come a year later when the lender comes to collect it and he brings it to court. And now, yes, now there are judges involved, and now there would be publicity is true, but they can't now create a new lien that the borrower never intended in the first place. You can't go back in time. It has to be publicized from the time that the loan already happened. So that way, if someone comes to buy any land in the meantime, the buyer will know that there's a lien on it and will take that into account. In the case of marriage, anytime you're buying something from a married couple, so any buyer will know, oh, this is land that belongs to this husband, but he's married, so obviously she has a lien on that property. That's already well known, so you don't need anything more to create a lien for a wife to collect her ketubah. But in this case, that's why you need a loan document that has signatures on it from the time of the loan. That's why the date has to be correct in the loan, and you can't create a new lien afterwards, even in front of judges who are ratifying the handwriting of the borrower. And now we come to the next part of the Mishnah. Arev hayoseh la'achad chitum shetarot ve'gomer. If a guarantor comes and he signs on to the promissory note after the promissory note was already signed by witnesses, in other words, he comes after the loan is already done, and later he says, okay, I'll be a guarantor. In that case, the lender can only collect from bnei chorin, from property that the guarantor has in his hands, but not any property that the guarantor had sold. Okay, this is as opposed to a normal case. Normally, at the time of the loan, right, the borrower says, can you lend me $1,000? The lender says, I don't know, I don't trust you so much. You have a guarantor? Okay, his friend comes, I'll be a guarantor. If he can't pay, then I will pay. Okay, good. Now we write up the document and it says, this person owes money to that person and so is the guarantor, and then the witnesses come and sign it. In that case, not only is the property of the borrower lien to the lender, but also the property of the guarantor is liened over to the lender, so that if the borrower can't pay, then the lender comes to the guarantor, and if the guarantor doesn't have cash or property on hand, then the lender can actually go and repossess land that the guarantor had owned and sold since the time of the loan. And that was the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. So now we elaborate on this law. Amar Rav. Kodem chitum shetarot gobem nechasim meshubadim. Lachar chitum shetarot gobem nechasim bnei chorin. Rav is really just expanding on what the Mishnah said, which is that if the guarantor signs on before the signing of the promissory note, then the lender can go and collect from liened property of the guarantor. However, if he signs on after the document is already signed, the loan already happened, and then the guarantor comes and signs on, and I'll be the guarantor, in that case, the lender can only collect from the guarantor's unsold property, but does not create a lien on sold property. That's what Rav said sometimes, but other times, Zimnin Amarav, afilu kodem chitum shetarot eno gobe ela benechasim benechorin. At other times, Rav would rule that even if the guarantor signed onto the document before it was signed by the witnesses, in other words, he was there at the time of the loan, still the guarantor can only collect from the lender can only collect from the guarantor's unsold property. In other words, the guarantor never has to have a lien on his own land. So we ask, Kashya de Rav aderav. Rav seems to be contradicting himself. And we answer, La Kashya. Hadechatabe peloni arev. Hadechatabe u peloni arev. There's no question here. One of the cases is talking about where they wrote peloni arev without a vav. And the other is when they wrote it with a vav. So what's the difference if there's a vav or not? So the first statement of Rav where he says that as long as it's signed at the time of the loan, they wrote, and this person is a guarantor. That's with a vav, because when you write a vav, then it's clear that it's all one compound statement. A owes $1,000 to B, and C is the arev, and the witnesses sign. Then it's clear that they're signing on the whole thing, and therefore the guarantor is on the hook, and his property has a lien on it as well. So, because it's all a promissory note, and the promissory note therefore creates a lien not only on the borrower's property but also on the guarantor's property. That's when you write it with a vav. But the second statement of Rav, that then you never don't have a lien on the guarantor's property, that's when you write it without a vav, because there it's a separate statement. A owes B $1,000. Period. C is a guarantor. Since that line is a separate clause, when the witnesses sign, maybe they're only signing to the main clause that A owes B $1,000. It's not clear whether or not they're also signing on to the fact that C is a guarantor. And if they're not signing on it, then it doesn't have publicity, and then you can't create a lien on land without publicity. So the Rav did say the law sometimes this way and sometimes that way. But he only said that that does create a shibud at the time of the loan when there's a vav, but if there's no vav, then it never creates a lien on the guarantor's property. That was the opinion of Rav. Rabbi Yochanan thinks that in all cases it doesn't matter. The lender cannot can only collect from unsold property. It does not create a lien on the sold property of the guarantor, even if you write it with a vav. And with a vav, according to Rav, says with a vav means it's all one statement, and therefore it should be that this is considered a signed a loan document with witnesses. Rabbi Yochanan says no. Even in that case, there is no lien created on the land of the guarantor. Mativ Rava challenges Rabbi Yochanan from a baraita. Aidim achatumim al shelat shalom beget pasul hashinan shemme al shelat shalom chatemu. If you have a divorce document that says A is divorcing B, and then the next line it says, oh, and by the way, say hello to my cousin, and then the witnesses sign under that. So this baraita teaches that such a get is invalid. Why? Because we suspect that maybe the witnesses are signing on only the immediately previous line that says, right, make sure to say to send greetings to my cousin. And so this witness is signed on that. The witnesses maybe are not necessarily signing on to the first line on the document that says that this person is divorcing that person. You have a long document, and so you don't know what the witnesses are actually signing on to. And so therefore it's invalid. That's what the Baraita said. Rabbi Yochanan, she'ilu pasul, ush'ilu kasher. Regarding this baraita, Rabbi Abu says that Rabbi Yochanan told him that this baraita is only if it says she'ilu without a vav, because then it's a separate statement, right? These people are getting divorced, and then a separate statement. Say hello, send greetings to my cousin. So because it's two separate statements, maybe the witnesses are only going on the second statement and not the first. But if it's written with a vav, right? This person is divorcing that person, and he wants to send greetings to his cousin. Well, in that case, the witnesses are signed on the whole thing. It's a valid get because it has a vav, so it's all one statement. So this is a contradiction to what we just said, because you just said, according to the Rabbi Yochanan, even if you write with a vav, u piloni, nevertheless, the guarantor's property doesn't get a lien on it. We treat it as a separate statement, even though there's a vav. We treat the ufloni arev as a separate statement, and the witnesses don't apply to that. But here it says, if you have a vav, then the witnesses will apply to all the statements in the document. So this is contradictory. And the answer is, hachanameh dechatav peloni arev. You're right. When Rabbi Yochanan said this, it's not if he says u peloni arev. In fact, Rabbi Yochanan agrees. If it says a vav, u peloni arev, and the witnesses signed, then they're signing on all of the statements, including the guarantor, and then there is a lien on his land. When did he say it doesn't matter? That's only if it doesn't have a vav. Then whether he signed on at the time of the document is signed or later on, either way, the lender can only collect from unsold property. But this is not true. With the vav, he can collect from lien property. So we're changing that first statement in order to make it reconcile with the tradition of Rabbi Abu. We ask, Yachi hainu derav. Well, in that case, that's exactly what Rav said, right? Rav here also said that if you write upiloni, and it's written at the time of the loan, so the witness is signed on it and it has a vav, then you can collect from sold property of the guarantor. But if it says Peloni without a vav, then they cannot. So now Rabbi Yochanan is saying the same thing as Rav, but it sounds from here, because you quoted it separately, and Rabbi Yochanan says, it sounds like he is disagreeing. So we answer, Ema v'chen amar Rabbi Yochanan. Oh, in fact, you should say, Rabbi Yochanan agreed, right? Rav said this, and also Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan did not actually mean to disagree. He was actually saying the same thing as Rav. Okay, we end with the conversation between Rabbi Ishmael and Ben Nanas, where, according to Rabbi Ishmael, a guarantor that comes and guarantees a loan after the loan was already finished, in that case, the lender can collect from the guarantor's unsold property, but not from sold property. However, Ben Nanas came along, if you remember, and he said, no, I think that this case is similar to someone who is choking, a lender is choking a borrower in the marketplace. And then a friend a friend of the borrower comes, he wants to save his friend, he says, let him be, I will pay you. So in that case, he would not have to pay. Why? It's not just that it's under duress. That's not the main point of Ben Nanas, but rather because the lender, when he gave the money to the borrower, it wasn't based on emunato, on the trustworthiness of the guarantor, because the guarantor wasn't even in the picture at that time. So since the lender did not originally base the loan on the trust of the guarantor, so the guarantor is never going to be on the hook if he came after the loan was already finished. The only time a guarantor has to pay is if the lender said, listen, I'm not going to lend money to the borrower. I don't trust the borrower. The guarantor says he'll pay. Okay, I trust the guarantor. If the giving of the loan in the first place was dependent on the trust that the lender has for the guarantor, only then the guarantor is on the hook. And therefore, according to Ben Nanas, if the guarantor comes after the loan was already finished, the guarantor does not have to pay anything, certainly not from lien property, and not even from unsold property. So on that, Amar Rabba Bar Bar Chana Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Afa pi shekiles Rabbi Ishmael et Ben Nanas, halacha kemoto. So if you remember, at the end of the story, Rabbi Ishmael says, if one wants to be wise, one should study Dinei Mamonot, right? Because there's no greater subject than this. It's like a flowing spring. And if you want to study Dinei Mamonot, one should go and serve Rabbi Shimon ben Nanas. So from this praise that Rabbi Ishmael gives to Ben Nanas, that's a very high praise. We would assume that Rabbi Ishmael is agreeing with Ben Nanas. Rabbi Ishmael says, oh, I didn't think of it that way. Wow, Ben Nanas is a genius. Everybody go study with him. So it sounds like he's changing his mind and agreeing with Ben Nanas. That's what Rabbi Yochanan says, no. Even though Rabbi Ishmael praised Ben Nanas, still halacha is like Rabbi Ishmael, right? Maybe he's giving praise to a colleague. Okay, he appreciates what his colleague said, but it doesn't mean that Ben Nanas is necessarily right. Mali Amar Rabbi Ishmael. So then the sages ask, what about that example that Ben Nanas said about someone who's being strangled in the marketplace? What would Rabbi Ishmael say about that case? Would he say that, he disagrees with Ben Nanas regarding the guarantor that comes afterwards, because that's it, he guaranteed it afterwards. Even though he guaranteed it afterwards, still he's decided to put himself on the hook. So if he agreed to pay, then he has to pay. Okay, his land won't get a lien on it because it's not in a written document, but he still agreed to it. Fine. So Rabbi Ishmael disagreed with Ben Nanas in that case. But what about the case that Ben Nanas brought up as an example of someone being strangled, and then the friend of the borrower comes and says, I will pay you? Would Rabbi Ishmael agree with Ben Nanas that in that case the guarantor does not have to pay? He just wants to save his friend. He didn't really mean to make himself responsible, or maybe not. Maybe he is also responsible in that case. Tashema Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, Chaluk Haya Rabbi Ishmael, Af beHanuk. Nice play on words here between Haluk and Hanuk. Rabbi Yochanan says, Rabbi Ishmael disagreed with Ben Nanas, even in the case of being strangled. Ben Nanas said, of course, that the friend does not have to pay. He was only trying to save his friend. He didn't really mean to have to make himself responsible. But Rabbi Ishmael says, no, he has to pay. Yeah, it's true, he's doing it to save his friend, but he said, I will pay you. So therefore, he has to pay from his unsold property. Halacha kimoto and halacha kimoto. Now, in this case, do we follow Rabbi Ishmael halacha? Rabbi Yochanan said before, then the case of the guarantor that comes after the loan, halacha is like Rabbi Ishmael. But is halacha also like Rabbi Ishmael in the case of the one being strangled? Tashema dechi ata Rabin Amar Rabbi Yochanan haluk haya Rabbi Ishmael af bechanuk v'halacha kemoto af bechanuk. Yes, when the Ravin came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, he said in the name of Rabbi Yochanan that Rabbi Ishmael disagreed with Ben Nanas, also in the case of one being strangled, and the halacha is also like Rabbi Ishmael, and therefore both the guarantor that comes after the time of the loan, and this is actually a subcase of that, a friend who is helping out this friend being the borrower who's being strangled, who says, I will pay. In both of those cases, the halacha is that he has to pay. Amar Rav Yehuda, Amar Shemuel, Hanuk v'kanu miyado mishtabed. And now the law in the name of Shemuel says that someone who's being strangled, if in addition to the guarantor saying, I will pay, they also perform an act of acquisition, right? The strangler says, you agreed to pay? Okay, take this handkerchief, and by taking the handkerchief, then you are doing an act that shows you are truly obligating yourself. You can't just do it orally, you have to do an act. So only in the case of strangulation, only if they also do an act of acquisition, then the guarantor is responsible to pay. But if they don't do an act of acquisition, then he does not have to pay. That's what Shemuel said. Okay, we can learn from this that only in the case of strangulation, that's when, because he's getting strangled, and it looks like the guarantor is only saying it to save his friend, but he doesn't really mean it. So that's why in that case, where it looks like he doesn't really mean it, that's when you have to add an act of acquisition. But if it's not a case of the guy being strangled, but just a regular case of a debt, and so the guarantor comes and says, I will be a guarantor. You don't have to do a transaction. You don't have to do a handkerchief or anything, because if he's saying it, no one's forcing him to say it. So then we assume that he means it. Upeliga de Rav Nachman. Now, this statement that Rav Yehuda said, in the name of Shemuel, contradicts what Rav Nachman said. Amar Rav Nachman, Arev de bet din hu de la ba'e kinyan, ha ba'alma ba'e kinyan. He said that if someone becomes a guarantor in front of bet din, then it doesn't require an act of acquisition, because he's doing in front of the bet din, and they're all watching, and so this is a serious setting. And so if he says, I'll be the guarantor for some loan, and he says it in front of the bet din, then no need for an act of acquisition. But haba'alma, if it's not in front of bet din, just a regular case of a loan, and he says, I'll be a guarantor, you do require an act of acquisition. So therefore, that's the difference between them. According to Shemuel, in a regular case, you don't need an act of acquisition, and the guarantor is on the hook even without it. And according to Rav Nachman, in a regular case, you do need to do an act of acquisition. Ve'hilchetan, the final halacha, arev bishat matan ma'ot la ba'ay kinyan, achar matan ma'ot ba'ay kinyan. If someone is guaranteeing a loan at the time that the money is being transferred from the lender to the borrower, then you don't need for the guarantor to also do an act of acquisition, right? Because it's all happening at the same time, and him saying, I will guarantee this loan, and being there at that time that the money is going there, then he is obligated. Whereas if the guarantor says, I will be obligated, but he does this after the lender already gave money to the borrower, so then that transaction is already over. In that case, the guarantor has to do a second act in order to put himself on the hook. If he just says so, then he will not have to pay. Arev de betin la ba'akinyan. But if it's in front of a betin, even after the fact, you don't need an act of acquisition. Why? Because from that very benefit, that gratification, that the betin gives him honor. The betin says, listen, we need a guarantor. Can you be the guarantor? He says, wow, the betin trusts me to guarantee something. See, they're basically saying by that this person has a good reputation. He is honest. He is trustworthy. So just from that gratification of getting that honor, he will be resolved to obligate himself. And so you don't need an act of acquisition to show that it's serious. That itself will make it serious. So this ends on a very beautiful note that a person's reputation, right? There's nothing more valuable than a person's reputation. As people say, you can't buy a reputation, you have to earn it. And you have to earn it by always treating people with honesty and with integrity. And that's really the main theme that's running throughout all of these laws, the laws of Nezikin, the laws of Dineh Mamanot, Hadran Alach Get Pashut, Uselik Allah Masechet Baba Batra, Chazakim Uberuchim. For everyone who got to this place, tremendous accomplishment. And we'll go on to Masechet Sanhedrin tomorrow. Baruch Adonai Leolam. Amen ve'amen.